I will share my screen and get started. Before we started, I was playing the Nibi song. This is Nibi or Nibe means water in Ojibwe. And the song says, "Water, we love you, we thank you, we respect you." So that was it's got a nice little story behind it as well. But I will, for the moment, just share that we're honoring water today. So I am a little bit about myself, and then I'll also read the land acknowledgement statement. That's something we do for as many times as we can during the year. These days, we're trying to remember that we're on formerly native land. So I have been at UW Whitewater for 17 years, and I have an interest in Native American issues, though I'm non-native. And the more I learn, the more I realize I need to learn. So this is a very big topic and very timely. So that a little bit from me. The land acknowledgement statement is for the university, but I'll also say for us here with the Monona Senior Center. As we gather here, we acknowledge that the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater and Monona Senior Center exist on traditional lands of many Native people. We welcome the duty and opportunity to share stewardship of these lands and this place in the 21st century. Turn up volume a little bit. While this state institution has a rich history for thousands of years, this region and lands were home to diverse Native peoples. The Ho-Chunk grew corn and gathered a living from these lands. The Potawatomi, then closely related to Ojibwe and Ottawa peoples, called this land home as well. We welcome and are honored by the responsibility to be good stewards and good neighbors to all Wisconsin Indigenous populations. In concert with Native American Cultural Awareness Association, I'm the advisor for that group. Native students, faculty, and staff, the university continues to explore durable and meaningful ways of acknowledging our relationship. And so I realize, I'm not sure if you see this thing at the top, but it's cutting off a little bit up at the heading, but Indigenous ecological and cultural struggles and resistance. Really, we've had a lot of struggles in Indian country, but I always want to frame it with successes as well, because I think we're kind of all of us sort of dancing on these two edges. Maybe with COVID now we have the crisis, but I'm hoping it will bring us some opportunities as well. So we're looking at Native neighbors in the Northern Great Lakes region and some of the severe challenges to their lifeways, the cultural gathering of foods and medicines. And specifically, I'll look at the Ojibwe and Menominee. I think I'll have a little bit of the Ho-Chunk in there as well. The focus on these recent conflicts certainly is related to fossil fuel industries, extractive industries, mining, but these struggles go many centuries back. But we only have about 45 minutes. So resistance to pipelines and mines is really the focus here, and to protect the land and water for all of us and those to come, because we're, even though they're the ones maybe on the front lines, a lot of these indigenous groups, the water is for all of us. You might have heard in the news a lot of things coming from Indian country these days. Water is life, is their belief system, and it is sacred in the Native American worldview. So with this idea and this really very deeply held and cherished feeling about water, it's not just a natural resource. Some of us might think of it certainly important to life, but I think finally contemporary scholars and advocates and activists are beginning also to see water as this precious thing to be protected, and not just a commodity or a quote natural resource. many people are trying to bridge these perspectives. We have the Western scientific perspective and the social science. I come from the social sciences, but I've been learning a lot more about the environmental science side of things. And then environmental justice is a movement to really protect everyone from harms. And these struggles are facing Indigenous peoples, but they really are facing all of us as well. And this is because water is a non-renewable resource. Sometimes hard to think about that because we know about the water cycle and we have the precipitation and then moves into the rivers and then eventually evaporates and goes back into the clouds and the cycle continues. But really what we're looking at when we're talking about fresh water versus the beautiful blue planet we have, a lot of that is salt water. And 70%, it seems, very, very full of water, but most of that's frozen in polar ice. And really, it's less than 1% of fresh water readily available for us to drink and use for all the things we need water for. And the Great Lakes are so amazing because they hold 20% of all the world's accessible fresh water. So we are here in a tremendously rich, beautiful place with our access to clean water. And we hope we can keep it clean. So the Native Americans are on the forefront, but what they're doing is protecting the earth for the next 7 generations. Seventh generation is a concept you might have heard of. It's actually been commodified, I think, in terms of you can buy paper towels now, 7th generation. But the idea is really that their decision-making processes are made with the belief that we better do today what will benefit people 7 generations in the future, which is a pretty long time, right? There's prophecies about this moment in time that we are at the 7th generation from when contact happened and when the struggles began for Native peoples from the West and colonization. And so there's a lot of hope for the 7th generation, which is coming of age now. The environmental justice definition comes from, there's different groups that define it a little differently, but the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, says that it is fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So it's a concept that is pretty much about fairness, right? That we should all have access to clean water, clean air. And unfortunately, what the environmental justice movement came out of was because there was not that wasn't happening to a lot of unfortunate groups, not just Native Americans, but in an urban setting, a lot of African Americans or Latinx people are faced with more toxins in the environment. There was in 1991, I believe it was, National People of Color Environmental Justice Leadership Summit. And they had several principles that came out of that summit. And I'm not going to read them all, but essentially that Mother Earth is sacred and we need balance and responsibility. A lot of focus needs to be on the political, economic, and cultural self-determination. And education is very, very important, appreciating our diverse cultural perspectives. So my focus on education is what I can do. There are some past successes. So I want to make sure when I get into the some of the scary stuff that may be happening, I want to frame it that we already have seen successes because of people working together. So some of you may remember in the 1980s, there were alliances across groups to support the spearfishing treaty rights in the ceded territories. And I'll show you a map in a moment of what the ceded territories looks like. They're very small reservations in our state, and in Minnesota and Michigan. I'm going to kind of look at these 3 northern states, but the alliances came together to protect basic spearfishing rights and other hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. the 80s to 2003 or so, alliances joined together to stop the Crandon mine from happening, which would have really potentially threatened the water quality in a little bit more of the sort of northeastern part of the state. And then there was a mining moratorium. However, it was overturned in 2017, and there's now, I believe, some effort to move it back into some more regulatory standards. Excuse me. Standing Rock, people may have heard of Standing Rock, where the Lakota peoples were met with people from all over the world to stop a pipeline, which it didn't stop it, but it did really raise awareness. And then it went forward in 2017, but then I think just a month or so ago with President Biden, I think it stopped again. So a lot of these struggles go back and forth and legal battles continue. So it's hard to sometimes say, was this a success or was it just a holding pattern? But there are some really interesting prophecies about the voice of the North rising. And more recently, you may have heard of the Pinocchio Hills mine. That was a big one in our state. We've talked a lot about the efforts under the Walker administration, and that was very much supporting the mines and the mining interests. Gogebic Taconite said that they pulled out because the iron ore price just went down. And that's certainly, from an economic standpoint, that's maybe the reason for the decision. A lot of people did organize though, and they say, well, it's a success either way. They're feeling, at least for the time being, that this is a success, especially because that mine was proposed right at the headwaters of the Bad River. And the Bad River flows north, actually, into Lake Superior. And that's where a very fragile wetland ecosystem provides wild rice for people. So my work, even right at the moment, we're talking about the Great Lakes primarily, but I will mention that I have done research, a lot of research since 2005 in Louisiana with Hurricane Katrina. That's really kind of what sparked my interest in a lot of these topics. And what we find is that we are very connected, right? We're very connected with the Gulf Coast because of the Mississippi River. And the Bayou peoples who live in the very, very far reaches of the Gulf Coast are also facing a lot of fossil fuel damages and climate change. So these are interconnections. The Mississippi River, actually, while Bad River flows north into Lake Superior, and the Great Lakes Basin has its own watershed, we're where I live in Milton. So we're right near, not too far from the Rock River, and that's part of the Mississippi River drainage basin. And it's 31 states out of 50, 31 states all drain down to the Mississippi River, and 2 Canadian provinces as well. So it is a really amazingly large system. And here we are in the bottom, and I'll end the talk with some of the pictures of my flyover of the Gulf of Mexico. But I'm going to spend a little more time specifically on the Enbridge tar sands pipeline, because this right now is the big stand. We had Standing Rock with the Lakota Sioux a few years ago, but now there's actually a bunch of people camped out. They've been camping out all winter in northern Minnesota. And one of the women who is one of the water protectors is on a 27-day, well, today is the 27th day of a hunger strike to try and raise awareness of this really, really scary moment that they're facing, to have a pipeline going through their wetlands areas and their reservations. So I'm going to show you just a little bit, see if this works here. Yeah, the map of the ceded territories. So that means that ceded means that the state, whoops, I've just lost myself out of there. I'll try that again. The boundaries for Wisconsin and Minnesota and Michigan are these red lines, and they represent different treaty times. The reservations are, you can't see them on this map, but are very, very small. There's, we have in Wisconsin 6 different Ojibwe nations, each with their own reservation. We have the Menominee Reservation, which from space you can actually see. It's a very, very dark green, beautifully managed forest. And we have the 3 New York tribes, the Oneida and New York and New England, and the Mohican Munsee and the Brothertown Indians. Now the Brothertown are not federally recognized yet. And at Whitewater, we're having a talk next week from a Brothertown Indian woman explaining why they have not yet been federally recognized. And then we have, of course, Ho-Chunk, which are buying back their lands. And we have Potawatomi. And they have some different reservations themselves. It's a little different in Minnesota, mostly Ojibwe. And there's actually Ojibwe also in Michigan. And so this is the ceded territory. When they made the treaties, they said we'll need to be able to hunt, fish, and gather off the reservations, because the reservations are very, very tiny. They could never have been able to provide enough food for their people. So they have always had, they have very severe regulations on what they can do. They have a lot of laws within the treaties, within the nations, have their own fish and game wardens and everything, but it's just different laws. So that's what the territories look like. And we'll go back to my presentation. The other thing I wanted to show you was, and explain a little bit about another prophecy. They have a prophecy called the Black Snake. And this said that when we reach a time where there will be the black snake expanding on the land, then this is a very a crisis or opportunity moment. We're standing at a crossroads. And when people started seeing these pipelines expanding across the land, they realized maybe this is the black snake. And so I'm going to just show you a little bit of this presentation, which is a bit of a more interactive. It's from Google Earth. And so you can actually see what it looks like from space. So we're looking at the Canadian tar sands. These are places on the planet that in northern Alberta, where they dig up sand, and it's very, very heavy, like they call it kind of the consistency of peanut butter. And then they have to process that sort of peanut butter to pull out the oil. It's very, very heavy, very, even much more crude. And if it gets in the water, which it has, it's really hard to get out. But this is what the pipelines are doing. They're expanding. They're carrying a sort of slurry, because you have to mix it with chemicals to make it thin enough to push through those pipes. And these are some of the pipelines across our part of the country, as well as many other areas. We're not just looking at these few pipelines. It's just this one right here across northern Minnesota over to Superior is the pipeline right now that they're trying to dig a new sort of, they call it an expansion, but it's actually going through new territory. And I think there's actually a better, oh yeah, these are pipeline spills. The pipeline spills are all over the place. Some of them are bigger, some of them are smaller. What we have in, I guess it's hiding behind this little note here, but in Michigan, there was the Kalamazoo spill in 2010. 2010 was a bad year. In the Gulf of Mexico, that was the BP oil spill. And then it was also later that summer that the Kalamazoo tar sands spilled into the Kalamazoo River. And that one was just such a bad cleanup, because it wasn't just regular oil. It was that heavy, heavy tar stuff. So that will just take you a little closer into line 3. This is the old line 3. It went through the reservation, and one of the reservations said, we don't want this to go through here anymore. But what that means is now they want to dig a new line. And it's going really fast. There have been 4,000 new workers brought in through the winter to try and get this through before the Biden administration could stop it. And so now they're coming up, I think, next week to another hearing. And that's why this woman here, Tanya, is on this hunger strike. And she's been doing this now for 27 days. And in the PowerPoint, you can click. I'll have people can have access to this if you want. Then you can watch her talk about her experiences and why she's doing this. So I think those are the main things that you could click upon in there. She says, "I'm here to stand in opposition to the tar sands. I'm here to protect wild rice, the water, and be able to continue practicing those rights, our inherent rights as defined in the treaties, which are the supreme laws of the land here." So since February 14th, she's been not eating, but water is sustaining her. Right? So there's a lot of risks. I'm going to probably go through this part a little bit quicker. The science part of it, it's interesting, but it's not my main area. There's a lot of damage coming from sulfuric acid into the water. I'll show you a picture in a minute what it looks like when you get sulfuric acid in the water. Some heavy metals. And when it spills, and you saw it spills a lot, unfortunately, there's been many spills. Sometimes they're caught quick, sometimes they're not caught quickly at all. And they're very often in the wilderness, right? So people have to notice that there's oil in the farmland. It happens a lot in farmland, unfortunately. But when it hits the water, that's the worst. And there's the wild rice is not only important because it's food, but it has a very deep cultural connection to the Ojibwe peoples and the Menominee. The Menominee actually get their name from Menumin, which is the name of the rice. And the Ojibwe have a migration story. They came from the Great Lakes, well, actually all the way along the Great Lakes, but from St. Lawrence Seaway, so from kind of Quebec. And it took them about 1,000 years to migrate. And then they came to where the food grows on the water. So that's why they have such a strong connection to the wild rice, because that's where they were told to come by the Great Spirit. We're again here just looking at some of the deregulation that happened under the Walker administration. A lot of wetlands protections were eroded. And there's, maybe we're interested in the native peoples, maybe we're interested in the fishing, right? A lot of our state economic support comes from sports fishermen. And unfortunately, the trout and the sturgeon are extremely sensitive to water, temperature, and chemistry. So we're also, I think, need to be stewards of maintaining our fish. We have a pipeline going right by here, right by Madison, right by where I live. Every time when I'm not teaching online, I drive back and forth to Whitewater and I cross the 61 corridor. And they have been wanting to expand that. And it crosses a lot of different streams, sacred burial mounds. So there's so many different issues that come from these pipelines. And these are some examples of some of the ones that have spilled. Other ones at Rusk County had a spill in 2007. And there's a debate, and people need to have these debates about whether it should be on trucks or trains instead of pipelines. There's problems every which way you can think of. In Quebec, a few years ago, there was a big explosion that killed a lot of people in the town. I forget now the name of the town, but unfortunately, it's pretty hard to have fossil fuels that are safe. This is another picture of what the tar sands area looks like. And this is just upriver from another tribe, the Dene in northern Canada. So it looks like a moonscape or something that's been excavated, not like beautiful green forests, which is what it should be looking like, right? This is a little bit of a different threat. We go from the pipelines to the mines, because there's also a lot of mining going on. Certainly for 100 years, they've mined in Minnesota, right, with the Iron Range up there and Hibbing, Minnesota. But this is the Menominee Nation the threat to them, they find, is along the Menominee River. There's a mine proposed here. And this is just such a beautiful area that it's hard to imagine it because sort of in contrast, to this. It wouldn't look quite like this. This is tar sands versus iron and I think copper. They want a copper mine here. This is proposed and potential and some of the mining activity going on around the Great Lakes. This is a few years ago, so I'm not sure how updated exactly it is, but you get to see these little orange blobs. Those are the reservations that I mentioned earlier. And then this one is the Back 40 mine, which is the one that we're talking about now. That's proposed, and they've lost pretty much at every permitting spot along the way, unfortunately. It's a tricky one in terms of government because it's actually in Michigan, even though the water flows into Wisconsin. So this is, it's definitely tricky from a state perspective as well as for the Menominee Nation, because this is where their origin story begins. This is a artistic rendering of what it would look like. It's a very, very deep pit. 2,000 feet wide and 2,500 feet long and 800 feet deep is what they propose. And it's right next to the river. It's 150 feet from the Menominee River. And it's a really scary thing for the Menominee because they're right downstream, and this is where their burial mounds are and where their creation story began. Some people I've met up there say they've been around for 14,000 years. Other people say 12,000 years, but whichever, it's a really long time. And this river has already been cleaned up by the government. So the government, maybe we're concerned more about the economic cost. They already spent a lot of money, $41 million to clean up part of the lower river. And now this is a new mine, and if it's spilled again, then we have to have that clean up again. So it's a pretty potentially damaging mine. And this is what it looks like when you have sulfide spill into the water. It is not a healthy looking river. Very, very orange color. And this has happened already in many, many miles, 12,000 miles of rivers and streams around the country. And you get these various chemicals as well as heavy metals into the water. And this is bad for human health, but also, of course, the fish and the anyone who lives in that area, the whole ecosystem. Climate change is the other sort of aspect here. It's harder to see, and it's harder because it's long term. You not have one spill that you can see right away. But it does have a lot of potential effects that are already starting to be felt. So I'm just going to hit a few of these of what's going to happen and already starting to happen in Wisconsin. The temperatures in the winter is expected to rise over the next century, right? All of this is taking over the decades and decades, but between 8 to 17 degrees potentially by the end of the century. That's a lot. That's Fahrenheit. Agriculture, of course, is a big part of our state and will be affected in many ways, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. Longer growing season, so that might boost some yields for certain crops, but other crops will have a harder time. So it kind of depends on what the farmers are going to be able to farm. And then the winter precipitation. This is the difference, I think, in terms of the excess water vapor in the atmosphere, is that 25% higher winter precipitation. I'm glad to see the snow melting myself right now. There's the first couple days without snow, but we did get quite a bit of snow this year. And then more heat in the summer and very heavy rainstorms. In 2016, there was a massive rainstorm in Bad River in the northern part of Wisconsin, and they had a huge flood, record-breaking flood that lasted for months to be, actually probably years, to rebuild roads, and Route 2 was completely washed away up there. So it has and of course we've seen this in just west of Madison, right? In Mazumani a couple years ago had terrible floods. Um, and this isn't, of course, just Wisconsin. We saw those massive floods and hurricanes in the Gulf, um, Hurricane Harvey and Isaac, Maria, Irma. You lose track of the names of all those floods and hurricanes. There's going to be likely, climate scientists say, declines in ice cover over the Great Lakes and inland lakes. And this is starting to be recorded already. Invasive species moving northward and expanding their range, and forest species. If you have the forest like the Menominee, their whole livelihood is based on that forest, and different forest species, it's a very slow migration, but you can start to see changes in which trees do well and which trees will not be able to do as well in that northern band. And then the manoomin, right? The food that grows on the water will certainly be impacted by climate change. One other thing that is another threat is frac sand mining. Now, this one is mostly experiencing by the Ho-Chunk and also by a lot of rural people who live in the western part of the state. And what this does is we don't actually have fracking in Wisconsin. We don't have the natural gas deposits, but we do have the best sand for the fracking process. It's perfectly spherical grains of sand. And so the fracking process that's happening around the country uses the sand from Wisconsin. And so they have really expanded their operations. Many hundreds of different pits are being dug here, and there's not that many regulations on this. It's happened very quickly. This is another view from space of a frac sand mine. And what happens then is people end up, it's not as much water pollution, but it's air pollution that gets very fine particles that we breathe and have a lot of respiratory problems when you're living near a frac sand mine. And they build roads into these rural areas, and so the trucks are coming back and forth all the time, 24 hours a day. And the local people talk about light pollution because they set up huge lights, and it feels like there's no more night because they go 24 hours a day. So this is another impact in Wisconsin. And the thing is, though, many of these crises are leading people to organize, are leading people to say, as a community, we don't want this in our neighborhood, and we don't want this not only for the animals and plants, but the people, and there may be a better economic solution. So there have been 200 communities across the US that are organizing around community rights and banning some of these corporations from fracking or other threats, and then elevating the rights of nature. So there's a whole movement called the rights of nature, which is very, very fascinating. And there's, every time I study this, there's a new place. I think I just read recently that there was another victory for a river in court. So some of the rivers are winning their rights in court. And the Ho-Chunk Nation voted to incorporate the rights of nature into their constitution, in a tribal constitution, to protect their way of life and protect their environment. So we have legal roots that some of these struggles are taking, and many other ways that people are resisting. Education certainly is a big one. Various different ways of political organizing and grassroots alliances building across these groups, because you can't have just one group doing everything, right? We have to have conversations, we have to raise that public awareness and realize that maybe there's also, from the Native point of view, there's a spiritual aspect to this. And so they do ceremonies, and they really are praying. And when Tanya is doing her work up in the camps at the headwaters of the Mississippi, which is where one of those pipeline crossings is, right at the headwaters of the Mississippi, which would really devastate all the way down the Mississippi River. Most of her day is spent in prayer. They see that prayer is a part of their political organizing. They don't see them as separate. And that brings me to the sacred Mother Earth water walks, which also have been really just phenomenally important to raise awareness about the protection of the water. So Ojibwe people, sparked by Josephine Mandamin, a grandmother from the Ojibwe people, in 2003 started walking around the Great Lakes. And she would carry a copper bucket and do ceremonies, do prayers in the morning and prayers in the evening with the water as a way to heal the water, and singing that Nibe song, the Water We Love You. Water is precious and sacred. It is one of the basic elements needed for all life to exist. This is their mission statement. And they have walked literally around every Great Lake. They walked, she walked herself about 12,000 miles. She just passed away last year. And she inspired all these young people to join her. Men go on the walks, but they don't carry the water because women are the water bearers. Life begins in the womb in water. And we certainly have water everywhere around us, but women historically, and this is in other indigenous cultures too, I found out, indigenous peoples around the world believe that women are the water protectors. And they've also walked along the rivers. They walked all the way from the headwaters of the Mississippi to the Gulf Coast. And I found this out afterwards, and I was just astonished because my work at that point in 2012 was more in Louisiana and working with the Lowlander Center and the Gulf Coast issues. And I found out later that the folks from the northern Great Lakes had walked all the way down to my friend's church. And they had a big ceremony at my friend's church. She's an anthropologist and a minister. And I thought, well, how beautiful is that? Coming full circle to know these amazing women, and that they had found out each other too as part of the struggle and part of the sort of hope as well. So there's a lot of issues, past, present, and future. I'll just take you a little bit down to the Gulf, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers. The Bayou communities, these are folks that live in the sort of little feathers of land that are left in Louisiana. It doesn't look like a boot anymore. Louisiana is one of the places on the planet that's feeling climate change the most extreme already. And the rising seas and the sinking land are making it lose land faster than almost anywhere else. And yet it's very limited in terms of how much we learn about this. But there's a bunch of different tribes that live there on the land that they had escaped from during the migration that was forced migration in the 1830s, the Indian Removal Act. And a lot of them escaped into the swamps. So the Choctaw especially had settled in this area. And the group now, the Isle de Jean Charles band of the Biloxi Chitimacha Choctaw, that's quite a mouthful. They are working with my friend Christina Peterson at the Lowlander Center, and they won a resilience grant in 2016 to relocate because their island is disappearing into the sea. And part of it's due to fossil fuels, part of it's due to hurricanes. They were hit very, very badly with Hurricane Rita, which followed just a month after Katrina in 2005. But they've been hit many times. And even if they just have rain, heavy rainstorm, they are underwater. So I have some pictures about what they're facing. I took a flyover in a little plane in 2012, I think this was, maybe 2013, I forget what year it was. And what this is a levee, right? You have just a big berm of land that's keeping the water out. And so people are still farming in the land that they can hold back from the water. But you can see sort of some straight lines that are opening up into water because the oil industry, the pipelines are filling the Gulf, and then the Gulf waters, the sea comes in, which is salty, and it mixes with the fresh water, but it makes the plants not able to hold on to the water. I mean, not able to hold on to the land anymore because there's too much salt. And so it disappears into the Gulf of Mexico. And they've lost about the size of Delaware, I think. In the last several decades, they've lost, it's about a football field size area of land every hour disappears into the Gulf of Mexico. Every hour of a football field is gone. And that's from this digging in these fragile wetlands. And the swamps, especially with the trees, are unable to hold, the trees are dying at a very rapid rate. So it looks from like this from the sky. This is the one road that goes to the island, Isle de Jean Charles, and it's impassable in a storm. Certainly in a hurricane for a long time, it's impassable, but even a regular storm. They're trying to build these terraces to kind of keep back the erosion, but it's not working very well. So this island here used to be 2 miles across and 5 miles long. And now it's less than a quarter mile across and 2 miles long. And they used to have hundreds of families living here for ever since the early 1800s. They escaped one thing and they settled and they reclaimed their lives and started a sustainable living. They eat the fish, they're fishermen, and now that land itself is disappearing into the Gulf. And these are the ones that wanna relocate. Politics comes in again, and the state of Louisiana has sort of usurped the money, and they said, well, we'll just build you a housing project, which is on higher ground. But the tribe itself had created with the Lowlander Center, it took them about 10 years. They came up with an incredibly detailed, sustainable plan for a community, which would bring the tribal members back, bring the children back, because so many have left. And they wanted to have a community center and a church and a store and really a little community. And that was what the grant was for. And they won that from the federal government, but then the state intervened. And so there's always politics that sometimes, derail these plans. So that was my, the last slide. I couldn't remember how many more I had. I have some citations here, but let me just leave it at the picture and then we can have a conversation, or I can also just not share my screen unless people would like me to go back to a map or something. And we still have 15 minutes and I want to say miigwech, which is thank you in Ojibwe. So it's I kind of got to the Gulf and realized I was out of land and I better stop. So at the end of the continent. So what kinds of questions does anybody might have about the water or about the native peoples and their cultural lifeways?
Yeah, I have two questions for you. You were talking about what kind of struck my eye is what you were talking about is the Enbridge pipeline that's going through Minnesota and other surrounding states. I have also kind of been paying attention to that as well, with the boundary waters flows right into there with northern Minnesota, and there's been a couple pipelines through Twin Meadows that are being proposed, and I just think it's really interesting how there's so many people out there trying to stop it, but at the same time there's other people that are like, no, we want it because of I assume because they said they can bring a lot of jobs to the area, but then the environmental impacts are probably twice as worse.
That is right. Let's look back at the map of this area. Yes, the conflict between, this is a classic kind of conflict, right, between jobs and the environment. And a lot of times when we frame it that way, which is what the media does, and we see it as either or, and communities do this as well, it's really divides families, it divides maybe one's own head, right? You work at these jobs, but then you have to come home to your family and realize that maybe your children and grandchildren won't have fresh water. There's some really interesting stories that I have in the citations about recent news. And that was what happened to one guy. He was working on the pipeline and he was like, yay, I can pay my bills. And then he found his family members on the other side protesting. And he had to give up his job. He said, I can't do this. But it's a tragedy because they so need the money, right? And it puts people into a terrible bind when you're not able to provide for your families. But you have this cultural push that many of the people up here feel is that they have to protect the land and the water. That's what they feel like, that's their calling. And it's not an easy solution. And it's kind of the canary in the coal mine kind of thing, is that they are feeling it now. But all of us at some point will have to face this, because fossil fuels are not sustainable in the long run for the planet with its heating up. And my brother's a climate scientist, so he teaches a lot about how to help people understand the depth of this problem. But it's also hopeful. He believes his website it's simple. The science is actually relatively simple. You add heat and it warms up. But it's also serious and it's solvable. He says, absolutely, this is something he's studied for 20 some years. And there are ways we can switch over to sustainable and alternative fuels. And that there's actually many, many more jobs already in green energy than there are in coal mining or in these other, the iron ore mine that closed because the drop out of the market. We had oil itself, right, drop out of the market, the bottom drop out when COVID hit. So these are some examples, I think, of how I'll stop sharing my screen now and get to see everybody's faces. And the fact that we have to make those decisions is really not fair, I think, to our future or to us. It creates so much stress, and I have to be hopeful, because otherwise it gets too dark to learn about this stuff. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I have just another question. You were talking about with that same picture that was up with the red line going through. You were saying that the Biden administration is supposed to kind of be making a hearing this week about kind of a potential plan, or?
Yes, I don't remember which. They've been through so many levels of the hearing process. I forget which hearing it is. I've tried to take notes on a speaker I saw recently, and I missed that exact particular piece. But there's the Biden administration, I don't think we're quite there yet, but the Biden administration stopped the Keystone XL pipeline, which goes straight across the Ogallala Aquifer, right? And that was another very contentious area. So that one was stopped, and the Dakota Access Pipeline was stopped. That's the one in North Dakota. So they're hopeful in Minnesota that he will intervene, because this is something that is it's kind of hidden from the news unless you really dig for it right now. But they're hoping a hunger strike will raise awareness, and there were 2 women. One stopped after 22 days. And that they're inviting people once it gets warmer. They're thinking people will start to go up there and really start camping out. But it has been just a few hardy folks all winter long. So
Interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you for the question.
I have a question. Can I see the sources again so I can make note of them and check on them later, because I want to learn more?
Yes, let me share back to those sources.
Thank you.
Yes, let's see. Share this back to here. I'm a little slow with my computer sometimes. Let's see. And we get back to here. The easy ones are the let's see, where's my play from current slide? Are the internet sources. I just made a bunch of links, but I do have also a bunch of books and articles in the next couple slides, which are more on Louisiana, because that's what I've been doing for 15 years. But there's the EJNet is environmentaljusticenet.org. And then there's a couple articles from, let's see, oh, there's a website, actually, Native Nations at the Nelson Institute has all kinds of really great resources for Native Americans. That's through UW-Madison. Glyphwic this is www.glifwc. Glyphwic is the Great Lakes Indian Fish and Wildlife Commission, and they have an amazing set of resources on their website. So glyphwic.org, especially related to climate change. The Star Tribune had something on the Enbridge deal, and that was dividing the bands and pitting people against each other for the jobs. That was a recent article. NPR, I think that's the Minneapolis newspaper, also had another article recently. Stop Line 3. That's a great website. So stopline3.org. That's the one with Tanya on the hunger strike. Indian Country Today is a great magazine. They had it was a newspaper for many years, and now they're just online. And I had something from the Pioneers, which has a prophecy about the black snake, and then the Map the Black Snake is the sort of interactive Google Earth piece. And then I can show you a couple. Oh, there's actually, it's a little bit of an older book, but it's a really excellent book. Let's see. I think that one is this guy here, Al Geddick's Resource Rebels. It's he is I think he may be retired by now, but he was from the University of La Crosse, and he did lots of studies, and also went to many of these hearings and organized with the Native peoples. And then Unlikely Alliances is a wonderful book, which I didn't give you the whole citation for. Winona LaDuke is very, very active on these issues. She lives in one of the reservations that's right next to the pipeline. So those are a few. I hope I went not too fast so you could write some of those down. and
no, I'm good. I took
email
pictures
me.
with my phone, so.
Students and young people and everybody nowadays. I forget that. I forget you can just take a picture of stuff.
It's very useful.
If I go back to the beginning too, I'll show you my, let's see, how do I get back to the beginning? Let's see. I can just, I know what I'll do is I'll type it in the chat, is give you my email. So I'll type my email here and in the chat so people can ask me any more questions.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. And I'm definitely still just learning about this. I feel like I've been teaching American Indian Studies and Race and Ethnic Studies for a decade or so, a couple decades, but there's so much to learn. Mm-hmm. I'm grateful to be able to share this with everybody today. Any last questions? Yes.
I have just a couple quick comments, and one, technology sometimes helps some people and others. Much of the sand mining in Wisconsin has been shut down because they've discovered in Texas they can use a cheaper, different sand. And so a lot of us have been shut down. And I was in New Orleans a couple years ago, and unfortunately I can't remember the woman's name who came and talked to us, but she was doing an awful lot of work on saving the bayou lands and the Gulf Coast. It was a fascinating talk. And to change subject a little bit, but you've been doing so much with the Great Lakes. Have you done anything with Asian carp?
I haven't specifically, but I do know people who are doing that. Absolutely. It's such an important issue. Oh, this week, actually, there was all week was Wisconsin Water Week at UW-Madison. And I only could take one day off from classes. I went on Wednesday, mostly to the Indigenous peoples talks, but there were some events about the Asian carp and other invasive species. So thank goodness some people are working on that, but I don't know what the solution is. There's so many of them, and they're trying to keep them out of the Great Lakes, but boy, it's getting awful close. And those rivers, they're just, and have you seen those pictures? They just fly out of the boats and they hit people, and oh my gosh, that's
Thank
another
you.
crazy one. So many issues to think about and to learn about. So I hope you all had an interesting way of thinking about this a little differently. With the worldview is quite different from a Western perspective, but I think we need to always open our minds and hearts. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. Just a quick
Thank
follow
you.
to everyone. Be looking in your emails later today. I will be sending a very short survey. And our speakers and Lita always likes to see a little feedback from today's presentation. And
Yeah.
Yep, and the recording will be on the Monona Community Media YouTube channel.
All right.
Thank you
Have a
again
great
for joining us.
Thank you.
And thank you,
Bye-bye.
Holly.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye.